In the year of broken oaths and collapsing thrones, when the sun hung lower in the Anatolian sky as if ashamed to witness the treacheries beneath, a man named Idris bin Marwan sat shackled in the cellar of the Beylik of Karasi, his wrists bloodied by rusted iron and his mind sharper than the scimitar that had once made him famous. He had once commanded armies, whispered into the ears of kings, and redrawn maps over candlelight and smoky halls where perfumed envoys spoken riddles and threats. But now, beneath a fortress carved from mountain stone, he counted the days not by stars, which he could no longer see, but by the weeping of water down the mold slick wall beside him, each drop a drumbeat of a world that had forgotten him, each echo a reminder of the betrayal that caged him like an animal. Outside those cold walls, the world he had once shaped with words and war was crumbling the Ottomans under the furious and calculating Sultan Bayezid, were sweeping westward like a tide of bronze and fire, crushing principalities that had for centuries balanced independence with fragile alliances, their banners pulled down and replaced with the black and gold seal of the Osmanli line. Karasi, his homeland, once a proud beacon of Anatolian trade and scholarship, was now a hunted deer and a forest of wolves. Its young babe, barely of age, frightened and full of misguided valor, had foolishly rejected Bayezid's ultimatum, choosing to stand alone against an empire born of endless warfare and blessed with divine ambition. And it was Idris, the very man who had once cautioned against this suicidal pride, who now sat condemned in chains for treason, not because he had betrayed his people, but because he had dared speak the truth, that Bayezid was not just coming. He was already here, hidden in whispers, in spies, in merchants' caravans, in the dreams of men who had already surrendered in their hearts. But what the young Bey did not understand, and what only Idris knew with terrifying clarity, was that the conquest would not be a storm, but a disease, slow, invasive, political, eating the bones of kingdoms from within, and that the Sultan's greatest weapon was not the sword, but patience. For Bayezid was a man who played decades against days, and Idris had once taught him how. They had met long ago, before thrones and prisons, when Idris was a renowned military scholar invited to the Ottoman court to advise on border negotiations with the crumbling remnants of the Seljuk. Loyalist Bayezid, a prince then, had watched Idris with the hawk-like intensity of a man who devoured knowledge the way soldiers devour bread after battle, and Idris, in his pride, had thought himself the teacher, not realizing that he was feeding a mind already hungrier than his own, a mind that would remember everything: the fault lines in Karasi's politics, the weaknesses in its army, the ambitions of its noble houses, the secret trade pacts that would crack under pressure like clay pots. And now, years later, as Bayezid moved upon Karasi with the precision of a surgeon, Idris knew in his bones, in the haunted hollows of his nights, that the Sultan's siege would not begin with arrows, but with letters, not with war drums, but with silk-robed diplomats offering mercy in exchange for surrender, with gifts to disloyal barons and secret deals with merchants who cared more for coin than crown. And as the prison guards changed shifts above, their boots echoing like the footsteps of fate, Idris began to think not of escape, which was impossible, but of influence. For if he could not walk free, perhaps his words still could. So he began to whisper to the rats and shadows, to memorize every guard's schedule, every crack in the stone, every twitch of the jailer's tired eyes, and most importantly, every rumor that floated down with the rainwater in the silence of confinement. Every careless word from above became a weapon, and Idris, once a master of strategy, began to rebuild his war not with soldiers, but with secrets. It began with a letter, scratched into a rag of cloth using blood and ash, smuggled through the folds of a bribe paid to a sympathetic cook who once served in his household. The letter was not addressed to the Bey, who would never trust him again, but to the Bey's mother, the iron-willed matron of the court who remembered Idris as the man who saved her son from execution after a failed campaign years ago. And it said only this: the Sultan will not strike, he will seep. Beware the gold that smiles. If you still remember the hawk at Kysel Gate, listen once more. It was a cryptic phrase, meaningless to most, but not to her, for she had once watched Idris single-handedly delay a Mongol incursion by tricking an enemy general into believing an entire army waited behind the hills of Kysel Gate, using only shields, torches, and a thunderstorm. A memory burned into her as both miracle and myth. And thus began the first ripples of Idris's second campaign. Not of swords, but of suspicion, for soon the Beast Council, long filled with soft-spoken men fattened on court luxury, began to argue among themselves. Why had the Sultan's envoy gifted them spices from Damascus when those roads were closed by rebellion? Why did the merchant guilds begin hoarding grain before winter had even whispered its name? Why had the goldsmith's daughter vanished the same night as the secret council meeting? And while they argued, Idris wrote again and again through trusted intermediaries and messages hidden inside trade manifests, and song lyrics passed to traveling musicians, each one sowing doubt, each one unmasking a hidden truth the Sultan wished to stay buried. The kingdom began to shift, not in open defiance, but in quiet resistance. A captain hesitated at a bribe, a clerk burned a ledger, a noblewoman refused a marriage proposal from an Ottoman ally, and Idris, still in chains, listened, as the guards whispered of unrest, of changes in orders, of sudden arrests at the port, and he knew, with a grim satisfaction, that the kingdom had begun to awaken. Yet he also knew that Bayezid would not wait forever. And when the Sultan's second envoy arrived not with gifts, but with ultimatums, the Bey finally understood that his mother had been right, and in desperation, he turned to the one man he had cast into darkness. They brought Idris from the cellar like a relic from a forgotten war. Gaunt and limping, but his eyes burned brighter than any torch in that hall, and when he spoke, the room fell silent, for he did not plead or beg. He commanded, with the weight of one who knew the mind of the coming storm. He will not attack the walls, Idris said, voice low as a tomb. He will split the stones from within unless you bleed him first, not in the field, but in his plans. And what followed was not a battle, but a chess game across cities, a war of ink and movement, false messages sent to Ottoman scouts, decoys marching under the banners of phantom armies, assassins paid to poison the wells of rumor. And in time, Bayezid, sensing a trap he could not name, turned his attention elsewhere, seeking easier prey, for even sultans must measure risk against reward. Karasi was spared not by army or tribute, but by the mind of a prisoner once cast aside, and as Idris stood on the battlements months later, free and cloaked in silence, he did not smile. For victory without recognition is still stained by bitterness, but he did whisper to no one and everyone, you taught him how to conquer, now teach the world how to resist. And so the winter crept across Anatolia like a quiet invasion, not with swords and siege engines, but with frost-bitten winds and the kind of silence that cracks the will more than cannon fire ever could. And as the bay horses were stabled and the olive groves stiffened under sheets of ice, the memory of Idris's resistance began to ripple outward into places he could not see, past the fortress spires of Karasi, past the markets where wool merchants huddled beside their scales, even past the icy tongues of the Sea of Marmara, where smugglers whispered of a province that had defied the lion and lived for tales, unlike soldiers. Do not tire. And soon even the Sultan's court heard of it, though not from spies or reports, but in the muttered verses of a Persian storyteller, who recited, with deliberate ambiguity, the tale of the silent hawk who starved the wolf. And though Bayezid was not a man to fear parable, he was a man to track its origin. And it did not take long before his court chroniclers traced the fable to Karasi, and the man who had once served beside him as military counsel and were scholar Idris bin Marwan, thought dead or disgraced, now risen again like a revenant in chains, unkillable, incorruptible, and worst of all, invisible. For what Bayezid hated most were enemies without titles, without armies, without borders. The kind who moved through the folds of bureaucracy and memory like smoke through a tent flap. And so he summoned Rafiq al-Sakal, the man known in the shadows as the architect of unmaking, a former janissary turned covert operator who specialized in dismantling influence rather than infrastructure, and gave him one task: erase the prisoner from every whisper and wall, not through assassination, which would make him a martyr, but through erasure, corruption, discredit, contradiction. Meanwhile, back in Karachi, Idris, now a reluctant symbol of resistance, found himself entangled in a court that feared him as much as it needed him, for though the Bey had restored his freedom, he had not restored his trust, and among the noble families, many saw Idris not as a savior, but as a dangerous relic, a man who knew too much and bowed to little. And so, while Idris drafted letters to distant principalities and negotiated secret trade routes to circumvent Ottoman tariffs, his enemies within Karachi's own court began to see doubts once again that he had struck a bargain with Bayezid to save his own life, that he had staged his imprisonment to rise again more powerful, that his counsel led only to prolonged delay, not deliverance. But Idris, who had long accepted that truth was a blade often dulled by fear, did not defend himself. He worked tirelessly, compiling intelligence from merchant captains and shepherds alike, creating a crude map of Ottoman movements, ports fortified too quickly, grain stores vanishing before winter, caravans traveling with too many guards, and from these fragments, he constructed the bones of a theory that Bayezid was not retreating from Karachi because of defeat, but because his real target lay further west, the crumbling Latin fortresses along the coast, still occupied by Christian warlords left behind after the last crusade, too arrogant to ally with Muslims, too weak to defend against them. And if Bayezid could take them, he could secure the entire western trade route through the Aegean and turn the peninsula into a launchpad for even greater conquest, perhaps even Rome itself, or Constantinople. And so Idris warned the Bey, if we wait for him to return, we will be fighting a sultan twice as rich and 10 times as feared. Our only hope is to make him bleed now, not in our hills, but in theirs. And thus was born Operation Zahir, not a military campaign in the traditional sense, for Karachi lacked the strength for open war, but a strategy of sabotage and subversion, wherein loyal Karachian riders posed as Ottoman allies and entered the western coastland as traders, guards, even religious scholars, and slowly began to unravel the Sultan's plans from within. Grain ships were sunk in harbor under the moonlight, local mayors bribed to delay tax collections, whispers of Byzantine reinforcements planted in drinking halls, and everywhere the same signature was left behind, a copper coin marked not with any face or symbol, but a single hawk feather engraved across its width, a message Idris designed not for clarity, but for mystery, for he believed fear fed on what could not be named. But even as Idris outwitted Bayezid's spies abroad, he began to lose the war at home, for Rafiq al-Sakal had arrived in Karachi, not as an assassin, but as a poet, a charming guest at banquets, a patron of local schools, and over months he sowed questions in silks and songs. He befriended the Bey's cousin, seduced a nobleman's daughter, donated to orphanages in Idris's name, and then revealed forged ledgers of theft, and slowly, the court began to turn again, not against Idris's logic, which was unimpeachable, but against his soul, which they now painted as blackened by ambition and exile. And so Idris, aware that time was again slipping away, took a desperate risk. He summoned to his chamber the one man he had never trusted, but always respected, the city's chief imam, a hard-eyed scholar named Sadiq bin Uthman, who had once denounced Idris publicly for his reliance on cunning over faith, but who now, facing the fall of the city, came not to gloat but to listen. And in a chamber lit by only the candles and guarded by silence, Idris told him the truth not of politics, but of fear. How his time in the cell had stripped him of everything except clarity. How Bayezid would not stop until the very memory of resistance had been sterilized from the soil, and how even now, somewhere in the court, his agents were rewriting that memory. And to his surprise, Sadiq did not argue, but placed before him a scroll of treaty, drafted in secret by the scholars of 3 neighboring beyliks, who had once refused Idris's alliance, now reconsidering after hearing the rumors of Operation Zahir's impact. The scroll required only Karassi's seal and Idris's signature, and thus, as snow melted from the hills and the markets opened again under spring's pale sun, the resistance entered its next phase, no longer a kingdom alone, but a union of fractured principalities drawn together not by love, but necessity, held together by the razor threads of Idris's diplomacy. But Bayezid, too, was changing, for he had begun to suspect that the defiance he faced was not local, but viral, that somewhere, someone was teaching his enemies to think as he thought, to predict him, to unbuild what he had built. And when a fortress on the Aegean coast fell not to siege but to fire set by its own governor, a governor Idris had corresponded with in secret years ago, Bayezid finally spoke Idris's name aloud, not in anger, but in respect. He has become my shadow, the Sultan whispered, and a shadow must be met with light. And so began the construction of a campaign not of armies, but of truth, or the illusion of it, a caravan of scholars, priests, and foreign scribes sent westward, bearing forged documents, false witness accounts, and edited histories, all designed to paint Idris as a traitor, a double agent, a man who served no side but his own. And as these stories filtered into Karassi, even Idris's allies began to falter. Some whispered that perhaps peace with Bayezid was wiser, others that Idris's resistance had become self-glorifying, even imperial in its own way. And in the quiet of his chamber, Idris felt the familiar chill not of defeat, but of erasure, the same slow acid that had once eaten away at the histories of men greater than himself. And so he made a final decision, one that would risk everything. He would reveal the original treaty between himself and Bayezid, drafted years before the war, back when both were mere strategists, a document that proved Idris had once offered loyalty, not defiance, and been rejected not for treason, but for honesty, a document that showed the Sultan's ambition not as divine, but deliberate, imperial, and consumptive. But to release it meant also confessing that he had once sought compromise, that he had believed in peace, that he had been naive, and so, before the council, he stood, weathered and worn, and read the scroll aloud. He made no defense, no apology, only the truth. And when he finished, there was silence, followed by debate, followed by a vote, and by a single margin, the council chose to publish it, to share it with the other beyliks, to let the people decide for themselves. And as copies of the document spread like wildfire through the markets, schools, mosques, and ports, a strange thing happened. For the first time, resistance no longer belonged to Idris. It belonged to everyone, and in that moment, he realized that his greatest weapon had never been secrecy, but sacrifice. The willingness to make himself smaller so that the idea could grow larger. And so, as Bayezid convened his war council to plan a final campaign into the west, and as Idris prepared his fractured alliance for the storm to come, 2 visions of power stood poised to clash, not armies, but legacies, not empires of stone, but empires of memory. The rain had not stopped for 7 days. And though the scribes would one day call it a sign, a celestial omen for the flood of blood that would follow to those living through it, the rain was simply cold, relentless, and maddening, drumming upon stone rooftops, soaking parchment, drowning fields, and turning roads into veins of sludge across which armies, spies, and whispers struggled to crawl. Idris watched it from the highest tower of the council keep, his hands clasped behind his back. the scrolls of old treaties and fresh intelligence strewn before him like a battlefield of ideas. And though his hair was whiter now, and the wound on his left thigh ached with the ghost of some long-forgotten battle, his mind was as sharp as ever, sharpening itself further against the whetstone of encroaching war, for Bayezid had begun his great campaign at last, not with trumpets or banners, but with the quiet consolidation of the western coast, a brutal efficiency of takeovers disguised as pacts, marriages, loans, and temple restorations. By the time most cities realized they were occupied, their taxes had already been rerouted, their militias disarmed, their local customs quietly overwritten by Ottoman edicts printed in velvet-bound volumes and distributed in schools. This was not conquest. Idris told the council this was replacement, slow and surgical, and it would reach Karasi not through siege engines, but through minds. Yet the council, despite their loyalty, had grown weary of Idris's warnings, weary of this endless shadow war, weary of the constant doubt and doublespeak, and some now pushed for a bold display, to gather the scattered alliance forces, and march westward in defiance, to burn a port city already under Ottoman control and announce to the world that Karasi and its allies would kneel no more. But Idris, ever the strategist, saw in such defiance not strength, but bait for Bayezid, he knew, would relish such a challenge, not because it threatened him, but because it justified his response, the moment we give him the image of rebellion. Idris warned, voice low like the rumble before a landslide. He will cease playing the diplomat and return as the butcher he always was. Still, the winds of war care little for the warnings of the old, and soon a faction within the alliance, led by the young General Kumar of Balikesar, took matters into their own hands, launching a rogue assault on the Ottoman-controlled port of Adramyttian. And though they achieved a shallow victory, torching supply ships and capturing a minor garrison, they also triggered the very beast Idris had feared. Bayezid, furious but calculating, mobilized his elite Sipahi cavalry and began a brutal three-pronged campaign under the guise of restoring order to the Sultan's western holdings. But in reality, it was retribution, and the weight of it fell not on Kumar, who fled into the hills, but on the common people. Villages razed, wells poisoned, entire districts of merchants executed under suspicion of aiding rebels, and Karasi, still licking its political wounds, was plunged once again into desperation. Its food stores already depleted from a long winter, its soldiers demoralized by the desertion of Kumar's men, and above all, its people terrified by the swift and sudden storm that Bayezid had unleashed. And so they turned once more to the one man whose warnings had proven true, and Idris, reluctant but resolute, began to orchestrate what he called the pivot, a full strategic inversion of Karasi's position from defense to misdirection, from alliance to anonymity. He dispatched emissaries not to rally troops, but to fragment them. Each city-state was told to appear neutral, to disavow Karasi's leadership publicly, to issue denouncements of rebellion, while in secret their resources were funneled into an invisible reserve of supplies, scouts, safe houses, and saboteurs stretching across Anatolia like an unseen nervous system. Idris called it the skeleton army not because it was meant to fight, but because it was meant to survive even after the body fell, a contingency plan for an idea that had grown larger than any single kingdom. The idea that Bayezid could be resisted, not with walls, but with networks, with minds, with time. Yet even as Idris laid these invisible foundations, his health began to fail. Nights of sleepless planning turned into fevers. A persistent cough haunted his breath, and his vision blurred at inopportune moments. But he pushed forward, driven by something that no longer felt like ambition or even duty, but the raw compulsion of unfinished work, the sense that history itself had placed a sword in his hands and demanded he carry it until it burned through his flesh. Meanwhile, in the Sultan's camp, a different battle unfolded for Bayezid. Though outwardly victorious, began to suffer from a deeper fear that his enemies had ceased to be men and become patterns, that his conquests were being unwritten as fast as they were inked, and so he convened a council not of generals, but of archivists and astrologers, demanding to know how Idris had foreseen his every move, and one old seer, half-blind and likely mad, whispered of a curse, a ghost of past betrayal, a mirror the Sultan had once gazed into and seen himself undone. Enraged by superstition, Bayezid ordered him executed, but the damage had been done, and paranoia now crept through the Ottoman camp like a fever, infecting messengers, delaying orders, and causing commanders to double-check even the most routine dispatches. And Idris, hearing of this through his endless river of couriers, smiled for the first time in months, not out of malice, but out of the recognition that his shadow had now reached the one place no sword could touch, the Sultan's mind. Still, he knew the war would not end with whispers, and so he enacted the final phase of the pivot, a stage collapse, the intentional leaking of documents that indicated Karassi's imminent surrender, the falsification of letters between generals, begging for mercy, even the quiet closure of border posts to give the illusion of abandonment. And Bayezid, cautious but greedy, took the bait, ordering a full cavalry push into Karassi without waiting for siege engines or winter provisions, assuming the kingdom to be crumbling. And that was when Idris triggered the true campaign. Every safe house lit a beacon, every saboteur enacted the same set of instructions. Bridges collapsed, grain stores burned, maps switched, even the stars obscured by fires strategically set in hilltop forests. And the Ottoman army, so precise, so swift, found itself in a land it thought familiar, suddenly hostile, faceless, unknowable. Their supply lines cut, their scouts misled, their commanders isolated. And by the time Bayezid realized the trap, the rain had returned, swelling rivers and freezing passes, turning what should have been a swift occupation into a slow, humiliating retreat through mud, smoke, and the rising legends of invisible enemies. And in that moment, Idris achieved what no army had done. He made the Sultan retreat, not from force, but from uncertainty, from exhaustion, from a war he no longer understood. Yet the cost was staggering. Entire villages evacuated or burned to deny the Ottomans shelter, allies turning on each other, and confusion. Idris himself collapsing from fever and coughing blood into his cloak before issuing final orders. And though Bayezid would recover and return years later with even greater fury, something had changed, for Karassi was no longer a province on a map. It had become an idea, and Idris, whether alive or not, had become its prophet. And in the blackened halls of the Karassi Council, where the torches flickered under the weight of smoke and history, the surviving members gathered, not to appoint a new general or draft a new treaty, but to record what had happened. For they knew now that wars are not won by the living, but by those whose stories endure. And Idris bin Marwan, the prisoner who had once been forgotten beneath stone and rust, now walked in every shadow that dared speak the word freedom. It began with a funeral that no one attended, at least not publicly. For when Idris bin Marwan's body was found slumped against the cold stone wall of his chamber, a crimson handkerchief clenched in his right fist, and the last half-written dispatch to the distant fortress of Tyre left unsealed beside him. The word spread not like thunder, but like mist, slow, low, and soaking into every crack of the city before the officials could even craft a response. There was no fanfare, no mourning procession, not even the ceremonial prayer, because to acknowledge Idris's death was to acknowledge his life, and that was too dangerous in a world still held together by his warnings, by his absence, by the tension he had taught them to respect like a drawn bow. Instead, the council declared a day of reflection without stating why, and those who knew gathered in silence. The baker whose flower roots Idris had rerouted to starve the Ottoman troops, the aging blacksmith who had smuggled coded messages and hollow hammer handles, the scholar who once burned his own school to keep a garrison from quartering their all of them. Ordinary people who had found in Idris not a leader, but a mirror, reflecting back their own buried courage, and yet, far beyond Karasi's damp walls, and cities still tangled in intrigue, and fortresses still flying borrowed flags. Idris's legacy did not die, it multiplied, because his true genius had never been in holding ground, but in dissolving the very idea of obedience to empires. And now, with his death, he had become incorruptible, untouchable, an idea beyond character attacks or forged letters. Beyond assassination or smear, he was no longer a strategist, but scripture. And even Bayezid, upon hearing the news, paused not out of triumph, but calculation, wondering if the death was staged, or worse, if it was real and irrevocable. For there is nothing more dangerous than a man who dies on his own terms. And so the Sultan ordered a quiet investigation, not to find the corpse which had reportedly been buried in a secret grove outside the city, with only moss and crows for witnesses, but to track the movement of messages, signatures, and codes. And when he discovered that, new dispatches were still being sent in Idris's cipher weeks after his death, he knew that the true war was only beginning, for somewhere in the labyrinth of the alliance, a successor had risen, not in title or bloodline, but in spirit. Someone who had learned not just Idris's tactics, but his ethos, and this figure, unnamed and unseen, began to issue orders under the seal of the feather coin, not with the authority of state, but with the authority of memory. And soon strange things began to happen in Bursa. An Ottoman magistrate was found weeping over a letter that simply read, "You knew the price when you lit the first torch." In Smyrna, grain intended for Bayezid's armies was discovered rerouted to mountain villages loyal to the resistance. In Pergamon, a defector was caught painting Idris's silhouette on the inside of a prison wall with soot and spit, whispering to the guards that you cannot kill a man who taught others to see. And within Karasi, now ruled by a regency, council of uneasy nobles and cautious commanders, the absence of Idris had created a power vacuum none dared fill directly. And so instead of a new vizier, they formed what they called the Table of Smoke, an informal, ever-changing group of citizens, commanders, scribes, and merchants who gathered not in the council hall but in rotating inns and shrines, bound by nothing but a single rule that every decision must answer the question, what would Idris do if he were still here? And this question, maddeningly vague, proved stronger than any constitution, because it demanded not loyalty, but interpretation, and thus birthed 100 new variations of resistance. Across the region, some peaceful, others violent, some focused on trade sabotage, others on information control, all rooted in the philosophy that empires are not defeated in fields, but in minds. And Bayezid, realizing this movement could not be crushed by sword or siege, resorted to infiltration. He sent agents posing as orphans, pilgrims, even repentant former soldiers, embedding them within these new networks in hopes of unraveling them from within. But each time one agent was unmasked, the network simply adapted, relocated, rewrote itself, because the system Idris had left behind was not centralized, it was viral, designed to survive betrayal the way a forest survives fire, by hiding seeds in the roots of forgotten places. Even so, fractures began to emerge, especially in the coastal cities where trade losses mounted and famine threatened. Many questioned the cost of this endless resistance, wondered aloud whether Idris's way was wisdom or merely prolonged suffering, and among them rose a figure named Kamar al-Din, a former student of Idris who had once been exiled for dissent, and now returned with a different message, that the time of shadows was over, that Karasi should form a new state, not of resistance, but of reform, aligned with external powers like Venice or the Mamluks, embrace diplomacy over subversion, and his words resonated, especially among the young, who saw in Idris a ghost but in Kamar a blueprint. And yet, Despite their difference in tactics, Kamar never spoke against Idris directly. In fact, he named his new political doctrine the Marwan Compact, claiming it fulfilled Idris's final, unspoken wish to outlive empires by building something new. And so the legacy splintered. Some remained loyal to the feather coin. Others rallied behind Kumar's charter of reclamation, and a few sought synthesis between the two. Meanwhile, in the heart of Bayezid's empire, dissent began to bubble not from enemies, but from within, for the Sultan's obsession with Khorassi, with Idris, with this endless campaign against ghosts, had drained resources, patience, and trust, and one by one, governors began to question his vision. Imams began to quote Idris in sermons, and soldiers began to wonder whether they were fighting insurgents or ideas. And Bayezid, sensing the cracks, did something no one expected. He offered peace, publicly and unconditionally, issuing a decree known as the Edict of Cessation, in which he offered to return all contested lands, release all prisoners, and recognize Khorassi as an autonomous protectorate, so long as it renounced the feather coin and burned every mention of Idris bin Marwan. The offer split the table of smoke. Some saw it as a chance to end the bloodshed. Others saw it as a final, devastating test. And so they turned to the only one who might decide Idris's daughter, Layla bin Idris, a quiet woman of letters, who had never claimed leadership, who had lived her life in the shadow of a father revered but rarely understood. She had not spoken since his death, not publicly, and when they summoned her, she came not dressed as a noble, but as a commoner, wrapped in travel-worn robes and smelling of ink. And when asked whether they should accept the edict, she said, "Only this, my father never feared peace, he feared forgetting." And so they sent their answer not in words, but in ritual, every city of the alliance. On the same night, lit fires in their central squares and read aloud a different speech Idris had once given, some on war, some on faith, some on failure, and then dropped the scrolls into the flame, not to erase them, but to seed the memory into every witness present. Bayezid, seeing this, understood the answer, and though he did not attack again, he issued one final order, to remove the name Idris bin Marwan from every map, every ledger, every official chronicle, and in doing so, he ensured the opposite. For as the name vanished from stone, it took root in song and story, and the names of children and rebel camps and even caravans. And thus, the prisoner who once sat forgotten beneath the earth became the axis around which an entire age would revolve, not as a man of power, but as the idea that power could be made to answer, not to kings, but to those who remember. The hills of Khorassi had turned green again, not with peace but with possibility. And as the wild iris bloomed over forgotten battlefields, and the vineyards began their cautious rebirth on slopes once trampled by ooze and ash, the people of the fractured kingdom found themselves caught between memory and momentum. A strange quiet where neither war nor unity reigned, but something in between, a pause before the verdict of history. In the capital, the streets were crowded with paradox, merchants setting up stalls beside poets reciting verses of Idris, the street children too young to remember the man, masons repairing city walls even as others chiseled down the names of long dead governors, and at the center of it all stood the archive of smoke, once a bathhouse, now transformed into the unofficial sanctuary of the resistance's memory, its domed roof blackened by candle soot, its walls covered in pinned letters, worn maps, torn fabric coins, each item a fragment of the story too dangerous for any one book to hold. Here gathered the new chroniclers, not hired by kings but chosen by consensus, former scribes and vagabonds, debtors, veterans, runaways, all sworn to record what the official histories would not. And their leader, a man named Harun the Quiet, was said to have been one of Idris's personal messengers, though no one could prove it, and he never confirmed it himself, preferring instead to listen, to collect, and to connect. Under his watch, The archive had grown into a kind of intellectual citadel, a place where strategy still bloomed in whispers, where resistance did not wear uniforms but ideas, and yet, not all who came sought remembrance. Some came to bury the past, to argue that Idris's legacy had become a burden, a religion without a god. And among them rose a voice sharp as flint and cold as calculation. Zara bint Kamar, daughter of the reformist who had once split the resistance with promises of diplomacy and modern alliances, now returned from Alexandria, where she had studied statecraft under the Fatimid court historians. And she brought with her new terms, new structures, and a new ideology, one she called the Peace of Iron. A vision where memory would not be erased but codified, controlled, no longer fluid like firelight but fixed like marble, taught in schools, yes, but only through state-approved interpretations. And she argued, with chilling eloquence, that if Idris were alive, he would have insisted on clarity, on structure, on stability, that endless revolution was not a legacy but a loop, and that Bayezid had not been defeated, only delayed. Her ideas swept quickly through the merchant class, who craved certainty, and the younger nobles, who had grown tired of balancing the invisible alliance Idris left behind. And soon the archive found itself under pressure, not from armies, but from audits, from summons, from officials demanding proper accreditation for those who preserved memory. Harun, sensing what was to come, summoned Layla bint Idris one final time, asking her not to speak, but to choose to decide whether her father's name would remain myth or become law. And for 7 days, she said nothing, walking the streets in silence, watching the people who had built their lives around a name, a shadow, a vanished mind. And on the 8th day, she returned to the archive and placed on its central table not a proclamation, but a single object, her father's last unsealed letter, preserved in wax and ash, untouched since the day he died. It was addressed not to a ruler, nor a council, but to the one who comes after. And his words were plain, painful, and unfinished, a reflection, a confession, a fear that even he, Idris bin Marwan, had grown too proud, too certain, too central, and that the future would only survive if no one bore his name as a shield. And when Zara read those words aloud to the crowd outside the archive, her voice cracked not in defeat, but in recognition, for in that letter was a man, not a myth, a man who had seen the danger of being deified and had asked, in his final hours, not for loyalty, but for restraint. And so a compromise was struck. The archive would remain, but it would never call itself the final truth, and Zara's reforms would be taught, but only alongside the letters of dissent, the fragments, the failures. And thus, for the first time, Karasi began to resemble not a resistance nor a rebellion, but a republic of thought, a place where no one name ruled unopposed, not even that of its greatest prisoner. But the world beyond did not rest, and in Constantinople, where the Byzantine court teetered under its own decadence, whispers of Karasi's new model reached the ears of disaffected governors, of scholars exiled by emperors, and soon copies of Idris's letters forbidden in Ottoman lands began circulating in Greek, Coptic, and Latin, carried by pilgrims disguised as traders, each one bearing the same final line in Idris's unmistakable hand. The wall does not hold the city holds the wall, and in Edirne, where Bayezid's grandson now ruled, a quieter empire fractured by his grandfather's obsessions, the resistance's evolution became a matter of imperial study. They did not fear Karasi's soldiers, but its students, who had begun traveling abroad, founding satellite archives in Aleppo, in Tabriz, in Cordoba, whispering not of rebellion, but of governance through doubt, through inquiry, through shared impermanence. And in this new era, Layla withdrew from public life, becoming a ghost of her father in the truest sense, not absent, but watching, nudging, ensuring that no one, not even those who loved Idris most, turned his memory into a monument. She spent Her last years in a mountain village teaching children how to question maps, how to read between treaties, how to know when a hero had become a hazard, and when she died. Quietly and alone, the people buried her beneath a stone with no name, only a feather carved into its surface, and above it they placed a plaque that read, in Idris's own words, "To resist is not to win. It is to make the future think twice," and thus, the prisoner who once sat in chains, forgotten by kings, now ruled an empire not of banners or cities, but of questions carried in every classroom where doubt was allowed, in every speech where silence preceded certainty, in every place where someone looked at power and asked, what would Idris do if he were still here? It was in the city of Tarsus, to generations after Idris's death, that his name resurfaced not as prophecy or parable, but as crime. For when a quiet schoolmaster named Nabi al-Kufi was arrested for teaching his students the 7 parables of Idris, those forbidden allegories once passed in whispers by firelight, the charge was not sedition, but historical falsification, a newly codified offense in the Sultanate's expanded legal canon that made it illegal to contradict imperial chronicles with uncertified narratives. And though the law had been written in the language of order, its teeth were sharpened by fear, for the truth that had always haunted rulers still lingered in the margins of Idris's legacy. That ideas outlive their handlers, and when memory becomes mobile, even mountains bend. Nabil's arrest caused barely a ripple in the palace courts, but in the lower quarters of Tarsus, in the dusty alleys behind crumbling madrasas and falafel stalls, the arrest became something else, a lit match, and within days, hundreds of citizens began copying the parables by hand, hiding them in jars, tucking them into prayer rugs, carving lines onto the backs of chairs in taverns, and for every copy seized, two more emerged, as if Idris himself had been waiting for this moment, a resurrection not of body but of urgency. And from this fervor, a strange new brotherhood emerged, not rebels in the traditional sense, but what they called the copyists, a loose confederation of scribes, midwives, cobblers, and shepherds who shared nothing but ink-stained hands and a common belief that the stories they passed were not weapons, but maps, guides to surviving authority without becoming its mirror. They were not interested in reviving the old resistance. They saw that as Idris's burden, not theirs, but they studied his letters, his failures, his contradictions, and taught them in secret gatherings called silent rooms, where no one spoke, above a whisper, and all decisions were made through written ballots, a practice said to have emerged from the rumor that Idris, in his final days, could not bear the sound of voices raised in anger. And while the Ottoman Empire still stretched vast on the maps of foreign courts, it had begun to hollow from within, not through war, but through contradiction. A slow erosion where more and more of its own bureaucrats began cross-referencing Idris's writings with tax edicts and military reports, not to rebel, but to understand the cracks, the slow, deliberate failures that Idris had once described as empires undone not by swords, but by certainties. And in Edirne, where the latest Sultan Murad III ruled from behind an emerald-inlaid throne, the court historians found themselves overwhelmed by a new intellectual threat, the so-called theory of dissolution, an idea circulating in underground pamphlets that claimed that Idris had not merely resisted Bayezid's empire, he had predicted its death, by outlining the very rhythms of imperial overreach, suggesting that every state which sought total obedience would one day forget how to correct itself. This theory, half philosophy, half prophecy, began to infect the elite schools, the merchant academies, even the legal training centers. And though no one ever cited Idris by name, his phrases surface constantly. The ledger becomes the leash. Beware the walls that never crumble. A city afraid to change is already at war with itself. Murad, though younger and less paranoid than his grandfather, understood enough of history to recognize danger when it arrived dressed as philosophy. And so he ordered a grand review, a sweeping audit of all schools, libraries, archives, and religious institutions, ostensibly to modernize them, but in truth to identify and extinguish the intellectual embers still smoldering in Idris's name. But he had miscalculated the terrain, for by now the name of Idris was no longer found just in books or slogans. It lived in the gaps between sentences and the pauses of orators, and the way courtiers referred to the first prisoner instead of his name, as though avoiding it somehow made him less present. And when the Grand Review began confiscating books and shuttering discussion halls, it inadvertently gave the resistance what it had lacked for decades: visibility. And with visibility came sympathy, and with sympathy, movement. The copyists grew bolder, staging coordinated acts of defiance. One night, every well in Tarsus was found painted with Idris's signature feather marked in oil. That could not be scrubbed away. In Smyrna, the city's main clock tower chimed not at the hour, but in irregular patterns based on the rhythm of Idris's last cipher. In Bursa, students staged mock trials reenacting Idris's imprisonment using Ottoman officials' own writings as evidence against themselves. And though the state tried to respond with arrests, censorship, and intimidation, the tide had shifted, because now it was not the rebels quoting Idris, it was the grandsons of the men who once hunted him, the daughters of the very scribes who had erased his name, the merchants who had once profited from war now quoting him to justify trade reforms, and thus the prisoner's ghost became the state's conscience, not through force, but through memory. And in Karasi, now a quiet hill province with no strategic value, the old archive of smoke still stood, its roof patched with canvas, its walls faded with soot and wax, and yet scholars still traveled from distant cities to sit in its shadow, not to worship Idris, but to wrestle with him, to argue with his contradictions, to study his wrong turns and unfinished thoughts. Because in a world still obsessed with leaders who shouted, Idris had whispered, and in doing so, had become the one voice no tyrant could drown. And when Murad died without an heir, and the empire fractured once again into warring courts, it was not swords but stories that migrated first, carried across collapsing borders by those who knew how to hide a scroll in a saddlebag or a cipher, and a child's lullaby. And in this new era of instability, it was said that every kingdom, before writing its new laws, first asked, "Do we leave room for doubt?" And if the answer was no, someone would invariably reply, "Then Idris is not yet finished with us." It was in the deserts of Al-Hassa, on the far eastern edge of what had once been an unbroken dominion of sultans, that Idris bin Marwan's name was invoked not as rebellion, not as memory, but as law not written in ink nor codified by court, but embedded in the spoken rituals of a caravan society that had survived empire after empire, by forgetting as little as possible. There, in a wine-gnawed shrine carved half into sandstone and half into rumor, elders of the Aljar tribe gathered each new moon to retell the fifth trial of Idris, a tale no historian could place in time, yet which every child could recount. By heart a fable in which Idris, imprisoned not by iron, but by a promise he himself had made, must choose between saving a town and breaking his word, and in doing so learns that honor without mercy is just another kind of tyranny. And though this trial appears nowhere in the preserved letters or verified biographies, it carried as much weight in the East as the true campaign that had turned Bayezid's cavalry back into the sea, because now, centuries since Idris had last drawn breath, his legacy had escaped the vaults of the archive, the orations of reformers, and the debates of dusty academies, and had begun to transform into something more potent and dangerous than truth, belief. Across the fractured lands once unified under Ottoman banners now faded and forgotten, local communities began using Idris not as a name, but as a lens, a way of interpreting power, failure, and survival. In Kufa, merchants refused a tax increase, citing the Edict of the Fifth Sparrow, a phrase never officially documented but understood as code for unjust burdens. falling on those with no recourse. In Antioch, when a judge overturned an execution sentence due to irregular procedure, he cited the Marwanic precedents of imperfect witnesses, a rule Idris had never written and yet somehow had authored, spiritually if not legally. His ghost guiding the hands of those who had never read his letters, only heard his silences. Meanwhile, scholars in the reborn republics of the North, places once governed by fear, and now struggling toward civility, began assembling what they called the Idrisian fragment, an ever-expanding, crowdsourced collection of sayings, parables, citations, and counter-citations, all attributed to Idris, some verifiable, most apocryphal, but all judged not by source but by resonance. Here, contradiction was sacred. For every maxim, its inverse could be found. Loyalty is the first seed of tyranny. Beside a people without loyalty are already conquered. Power should fear ideas. Beside ideas should fear unchecked power. And the scholars, instead of resolving these tensions, preserved them, declaring that Idris's true teaching was not resolution, but responsibility, that the task of the future was not to obey him, but to argue with him well. And yet, this flowering of philosophical decentralization came with its own shadows, for there were those who saw in Idris not a prophet of doubt, but a mask for control, and chief among them was Emir Bashar of Diyarbakir, a charismatic warlord turned political reformer, who had risen on the back of populist sermons peppered with Idrisian language, only to turn it into a bludgeon once in power, claiming to be the heir of Idris's vision. Bashar established the Marwanic Tribunal, a court designed to root out false interpretations of Idris's teachings, and within weeks, poets were jailed, historians exiled, teachers silenced, not for opposing Idris, but for invoking him differently than Basharat's court allowed. And in this, the warning Idris himself had once muttered from a cell: every truth that cannot be contradicted becomes a crown, came roaring back to life. Resistance to Basharat's tribunal took many forms, but the most enduring began with a single letter, smuggled from a mountain monastery by a young novitiate named Firdaz, addressed not to any ruler or assembly, but to the future reader of all our failures. The letter, known simply as the Stone Reply, dissected Basharat's claim to Idris's legacy, not with politics, but with grief, asking why those who invoke the prisoner always seem to build more prisons. The letter went viral before such a word existed, and soon copies were found etched into the backs of prayer benches, wrapped around candles, painted beneath bridges. Basharat's response was brutal and swift. The monastery was razed, Firdaz arrested, and her trial made public. But when she was asked if she would renounce her words, she answered with a single sentence: if Idris were alive, he would be here beside me, not beside you. And that phrase, recorded by a scribe sympathetic to her cause, became a rallying cry not only for dissidents in Basharat's domain, but for thinkers across the continent who had grown weary of Idris being used as shield and sword. Alike, in response, a group of archivists, exiles, and silent monks convened at the old ruins of the original archive of Smoking Karasi, and there they formed what would come to be known as the Feather Council, not a governing body, but a stewardship whose only mission was to protect Idris's story from being owned. They did not declare doctrines, did not publish manifestos. Instead, they offered counter-commentaries, side notes, alternative readings, teaching that the truth of Idris was not what he said, but that he changed what could be said. And slowly, painfully, the grip of Basharat's tribunal began to break. Not through war, but through saturation. There were simply too many Idrises now, too many stories, too many communities whose identities had been shaped in dialogue, not obedience. And when Basharat's own son was caught transcribing the Stone Reply into the margins of an imperial ledger, the regime collapsed not in flame, but in confusion, unable to decide whether to punish or protect its own blood. And thus, the seventh arc of Idris's legacy closed not with triumph, but with return. His teachings, once buried beneath the boots of empire, now danced among the voices of the free and the fallible, no longer demanding allegiance, only reflection. And so the prisoner who once escaped through wit and patience now rolled through contradiction, not as a ghost behind the curtain, but as the breath inside the question. When you build your future, do you leave room for doubt? It began as so many things in Idris's long shadow began, with a child nameless at first, barefoot and silent, found wandering the borderlands of the shattered Kala Confederacy with a wax tablet around her neck and nothing on it but a single phrase carved in rough script. I do not believe in rulers, but I believe in stories. She would come to be called Sira, though that was not the name she was born with, and it was not the name she used when she first began speaking in the marketplaces of ruined cities and trade posts, her voice thin but clear, telling tales of Idris not as hero or martyr, but as questioned not what did he do, but what did we learn. And though she was no older than 12 when she began, her words had the cadence of memory, long practiced, and soon, in towns where walls bore still fading murals of the feather coin, crowds gathered not to resist or to riot, but to listen to stories they thought they already knew, told again in a way that made them ache. Her tales did not glorify war, nor excuse failure in one story. Idris miscalculates and causes the death of a village in another. He lies to a friend and regrets it for years. In a third, he chooses survival over honesty, and spends the rest of his life trying to reconcile with himself and in every version. Idris emerges not as ideal, but as human, and this, more than any doctrine or dogma, became Sira's revolution, the permission to be fallible without becoming corrupted. She did not call her gathering schools or sermons, or resistance cells. She called them interruptions, and each one began with the same invocation: tell me what they told you, and let me show you what they left out. By the time she was 20, the interruption movement had spread across 6 territories, with gatherings held in abandoned bathhouses, empty amphitheaters, and even in the crypts of forgotten temples. And it was here, in these broken places, that a new generation began to breathe life into Idris, not as a memory, but as a methodology, one that prioritized pause over pride, process over purity, humility over haste. And with the spread came danger, as always, for the ruling governorates, desperate to maintain stability in a region still reeling from famine, began to see the interruption as a kind of slow-burning insurgency, not of weapons, but of worldview, and worldviews, they understood, are harder to crush than men. So they dispatched spies, bribed leaders, outlawed gatherings, and even offered Sira titles, hoping to corrupt what they could not coerce. But she refused all offices, all uniforms, all declarations, insisting that once you name the fire, you forget to feel the heat. The more they press her to define, the more she fragmented, moving constantly, never staying more than a week in any city, her words scattering like pollen into minds, both fertile and suspicious. And as governments fell and rose again, as borders shifted and trees collapsed, it was her namelessness that made her dangerous, for one cannot arrest a movement without a center. But all things, even ideas, must confront the mirror eventually, and that mirror came in the form of a man named Selim of the Ridge, a former scholar turned archivist turned interrogator, who had once studied at the great University of Khorasan, before it burned in the second fire of Bayezid's line, and who now served the crumbling empire of the Sable Banner as Minister of Corrective Histories, a title both terrifying and ridiculous, depending on who heard it. Selim was not cruel, but he was convinced that memory must be clean to be useful, that contradictions weaken a people, that doubt is a disease, and to him, the interruption was not enlightenment, but erosion. And so he pursued Sira not with soldiers but with paper, issuing declarations, rebuttals, corrected editions of Idris's letters with footnotes so extensive they buried the original thought, and eventually, an edict titled the Harmonized Legacy Act, which declared Idris to be a great thinker of loyalty and imperial harmony, and criminalized any version of his story that included contradiction, ambiguity, or emotional excess. This rewriting provoked a deep fracture even among Idris's own inheritors. For some, weary of being hunted, welcomed the chance to have Idris officially recognized at last, even if it came with compromise. Others, especially those in the interruption movement, saw it as a final betrayal, a theft of uncertainty itself, and Sira, for the first time, disappeared entirely, leaving behind not words, but silence. Her absence became its own story, its own spark. And for 10 years, the movement split. Some formalized, creating academies and print houses, codifying lessons from Idris's life into textbooks and ethics guides. Others returned underground, whispering that true legacy cannot be standardized, and drawing chalk feathers on city walls at night, a signal that doubt still lived here. And then, without warning, Sira returned not in person, but in a single scroll delivered anonymously to the crumbling halls of the Imperial Forum in Almasso, where Selim was scheduled to speak. The scroll contained nothing but questions, 71 of them, ranging from what is the price of clarity to when a history serves power, can it still serve truth? And though Selim scoffed, the questions went viral, reprinted on broadsheets, recited in weddings and trials and graduation ceremonies, each one a tiny blade chipping away at certainty. Selim's influence faded, and with his departure came something stranger still, a mutual recognition among former enemies, that perhaps Idris could no longer be a single story, that perhaps the only way to honor him was to stop claiming him altogether. And so, across 1,000 cities, the stories multiplied. Idris the prisoner, Idris the coward, Idris the father, Idris the forger, Idris the failure, Idris the fire starter, and each of these, even the most contradictory, were preserved, recited, translated, and shared without hierarchy. In some places, they held annual debates called the Confessions, where each speaker had to argue why Idris was wrong, and these were considered sacred. In others, children were taught to write their own versions of his life as initiation into citizenship, a ritual called learning the unknowable. And in the ruins of the old Karasi hilltop keep, now a garden of moss and reeds, pilgrims still came, not to pray, but to sit and argue and weep and write. And one of them, an unnamed girl no older than Sira when she began, carved a phrase into a rock beneath the wind-whipped grass. He outwitted the Sultan. Yes, but only because he first outwitted himself. And so the prisoner's story, once bound by blood and empire, now danced across time like 1,000 birds in flight, never fixed, never final, always circling the same question: what does it mean to survive without becoming the thing you fled? It was in the twilight of the world's last age of manuscripts, when scrolls still whispered across borders, and parchment still bore the scent of sweat, ink, an exile, that Idris bin Marwan's name passed once more through fire, not literal, but cultural, as a newly crowned caliph in the southern peninsula. Na al-Rashid too rose to power not with conquest, but with consensus, gathering to his side poets, jurists, and those whom history had long silenced, and in doing so, he unearthed an idea that had lain dormant since Idris's death, that resistance, if not carefully tended, curdles into myth, and myth, once canonized, becomes no different than the empire it once sought to undo. Na's father had died in obscurity, a minor governor executed in a failed coup against the distant Ottoman remnant states. But Na had grown up under the weight of forbidden books, each one speaking the language of questioning, and at the age of 17, while sweeping dust from a collapsed ziggurat, he found a copper-plated copy of the Feather Coin Dialogues, a once outlawed compendium of Idrisian riddles, and it was this, not doctrine or sword, that lit the furnace of his conviction. By the time he came to rule, he declared that his court would serve not as throne, but as threshold of passage between the known and the doubted, and so he built the Hall of Contradictions, a marble hall with no central dais, where every wall bore a quote of Idris, each inscribed beside its contradiction, with no commentary. Only silence, and it was there, in that sacred ambiguity, that the great debates of the New Age began. His advisors included the scorned, the shamed, the formerly imprisoned, and among them was an aging woman with oil-stained hands, named Aliyah of Samara, who had once sewn false maps for rebels and had spent 20 years in the mines for it, and whose first question upon entering the hall was, what if Idris had chosen to die early? Would we be free from him by now? And instead of exile, she was named Chief Keeper of Divergence, tasked with preserving dissent even against Na himself. But while this intellectual republic flourished, it stirred unease beyond its borders, especially among the Northern Federations, who had long taught a streamlined version of Idris the brave prisoner, the righteous strategist, the unblemished martyr, and to now see his image complicated, fragmented, even criticized from within a state that bore his values, was deeply unsettling in some cities. Statues of Idris were quietly dismantled, not in hatred but in embarrassment, as if their simplicity now seemed naive. Others doubled down, creating new relics, new holidays, new rituals in his name, the Feast of First Silence, the Shadow March, even a controversial baptism where newborns were wrapped in gray linen, to symbolize the prison Idris once escaped. And as these cults of memory intensified, the Caliphate of Na began facing its greatest paradox. How do you defend an idea that resists being defended? How do you protect a man who never wanted to be preserved? It was in this crucible that a strange and final player entered the scene. The archivist from the Ice Cities, a figure known only as Tahir, who arrived barefoot and veiled, carrying with him a tome bound in ironwood, claiming it to be the first draft, a journal Idris had kept before his first imprisonment, never shared, never quoted, and written not for posterity, but as confession. The existence of such a book defied all known histories, yet the writing, the ink, the hesitation and the syntax all bore the unmistakable soul of a man still forming the questions he would one day be known for answering, and its contents were devastating. Idris, unsure, bitter, petty, often afraid, questioning his own worth, mocking his allies, envying tyrants, dreaming not of freedom, but of obscurity, and for many who read it, this version of the prisoner was unbearable to human, to flawed, to alive. Protests erupted across the caliphate, both in celebration and outrage, some hailing the journal as Idris's final gift, the surrender of his myth, others decrying it as forgery, heresy, a calculated sabotage of a sacred image. Na al-Rashid, too, after days in seclusion, emerged not with judgment, but with a question. Does truth diminish the dead or free the living? And with that, he ordered the journal placed in the Hall of Contradictions, beside Idris's most famous quote, "Even in chains, I shape the air around me," inviting all who entered to sit between these two poles, the ideal and the broken, the legacy and the lost. And so Idris, who had once escaped a dungeon with nothing but silence and wit, now escaped something deeper, the grip of perfection. From that moment on, the hall became pilgrimage for those seeking not answers, but mirrors, and scholars began a new tradition called the Marwan Descent, a public reading of Idris's worst moments, followed by communal reflections not on what should have been done, but what we do now in the ruins of that imperfection. In distant regions, the backlash was fierce. One empire declared Idris's name cursed. Another rewrote him as a cautionary tale, but even there, the very effort to erase him continued the cycle. He had long prophesied, "If I am remembered only to be feared, then I am still in power." And back in Karachi, over the ruins of his earliest prison, a wind chime made of broken quills hung from a fig tree, placed there by an anonymous traveler. Each chime etched with a single word: doubt, mercy, silence, return, and uncertain nights. When the wind came from the east and the stars blinked slow above the bones of the old walls, the chimes would ring, and those who slept nearby would dream of a man sitting alone, writing not for the world, but against it, not to be followed, but to be questioned. And so Idris bin Marwan, who outwitted a sultan, who saved a kingdom, who fractured an empire with nothing but memory, now stood as neither icon nor traitor, neither savior nor ghost, but as the question beneath all others: what will you do? Now that the truth no longer needs to be beautiful, in the end, it was not the wars nor the speeches, not the prisons nor the scrolls, not the statues torn down or the tributes raised high, but the quiet erasures, the forgotten corners. The only way to honor him was to stop claiming him altogether. And so, across 1,000 cities, the stories multiplied. Idris the prisoner, Idris the coward, Idris the father, Idris the forger, Idris the failure, Idris the fire starter, and each of these, even the most contradictory, were preserved, recited, translated, and shared without hierarchy. In some places, they held annual debates called the Confessions, where each speaker had to argue why Idris was wrong, and these were considered sacred. In others, children were taught to write their own versions of his life as initiation into citizenship, a ritual called learning the unknowable. And in the ruins of the old Karasi hilltop keep now a garden of moss and reeds, pilgrims still came, not to pray, but to sit and argue and weep and write. And one of them, an unnamed girl no older than Sira when she began, carved a phrase into a rot beneath the windward grass. He outwitted the Sultan. Yes, but only because he first outwitted himself. And so the prisoner's story, once bound by blood and empire, now danced across time like 1,000 birds in flight, never fixed, never final, always circling the same question: what does it mean to survive without becoming the thing you fled? It was in the twilight of the world's last age of manuscripts, when scrolls still whispered across borders, and parchment still bore the scent of sweat, an exile, that Idris bin Marwan's name passed once more through fire, not literal, but cultural, as a newly crowned caliph in the southern peninsula. Na al-Rashid too rose to power not with conquest, but with consensus, gathering to his side poets, jurists, and those whom history had long silenced, and in doing so, he unearthed an idea that had lain dormant since Idris's death, that resistance, if not carefully tended, curdles into myth, and myth, once canonized, becomes no different than the empire it once sought to undo. Na's father had died in obscurity, a minor governor executed in a failed coup against the distant Ottoman remnant states. But Na had grown up under the weight of forbidden books, each one speaking the language of questioning, and at the age of 17, while sweeping dust from a collapsed ziggurat, he found a copper-plated copy of the Feather Coin Dialogues, a one-outlawed compendium of Idrisian riddles, and it was this, not doctrine or sword, that lit the furnace of his conviction. By the time he came to rule, he declared that his court would serve not as throne, but as threshold of passage between the known and the doubted, and so he built the Hall of Contradictions, a marble hall with no central dais, where every wall bore a quote of Idris, each inscribed beside its contradiction, with no commentary, only silence, and it was there, in that sacred ambiguity, that the great debates of the new age began. His advisors included the scorned, the shamed, the formerly imprisoned, and among them was an aging woman with oil-stained hands, named Aliyah of Samara, who had once sewn false maps for rebels and had spent 20 years in the mines for it, and whose first question upon entering the hall was, what if Idris had chosen to die early? Would we be free from him by now? And instead of exile, she was named chief keeper of divergence, tasked with preserving the scent even against Na himself. But while this intellectual republic flourished, it stirred unease beyond its borders, especially among the northern federations, who had long taught a streamlined version of Idris the brave prisoner, the righteous strategist, the unblemished martyr, and to now see his image complicated, fragmented, even criticized from within a state that bore his values, was deeply unsettling. In some cities, statues of Idris were quietly dismantled, not in hatred but in embarrassment, as if their simplicity now seemed naive. Others doubled down, creating new relics, new holidays, new rituals in his name: the Feast of First Silence, the Shadow March, even a controversial baptism where newborns were wrapped in gray linen, to symbolize the prison Idris once escaped. And as these cults of memory intensified, the Caliphate of Na began facing its greatest paradox. How do you defend an idea that resists being defended? How do you protect a man who never wanted to be preserved? It was in this crucible that a strange and final player entered the scene. The archivist from the Ice Cities, a figure known only as Tahir, who arrived barefoot and veiled, carrying with him a tome bound in ironwood, claiming it to be the first draft, a journal Idris had kept before his first imprisonment, never shared, never quoted, and written not for posterity, but as confession. The existence of such a book defied all known histories, yet the writing, the ink, the hesitation, and the syntax all bore the unmistakable soul of a man still forming the questions he would one day be known for answering, and its contents were devastating. Idris, unsure, bitter, petty, often afraid, questioning his own worth, mocking his allies, envying tyrants, dreaming not of freedom, but of obscurity. And for many who read it, this version of the prisoner was unbearable, to human, to flawed, to alive. Protests erupted across the caliphate, both in celebration and outrage, some hailing the journal as Idris's final gift, the surrender of his myth, others decrying it as forgery, heresy, a calculated sabotage of a sacred image. Na al-Rashid, too, after days in seclusion, emerged not with judgment, but with a question: does truth diminish the dead or free the living? And with that, he ordered the journal placed in the Hall of Contradictions, beside Idris's most famous quote: "Even in chains, I shape the air around me," inviting all who entered to sit between these two poles, the ideal and the broken, the legacy and the lost. And so Idris, who had once escaped a dungeon with nothing but silence and wit, now escaped something deeper, the grip of perfection. From that moment on, the hall became pilgrimage for those seeking not answers, but mirrors. And scholars began a new tradition called the Marwan Descent, a public reading of Idris's worst moments, followed by communal reflections not on what should have been done, but what we do now in the ruins of that imperfection. In distant regions, the backlash was fierce. One empire declared Idris's name cursed. Another rewrote him as a cautionary tale, but even there, the very effort to erase him continued the cycle. He had long prophesied, "If I am remembered only to be feared, then I am still in power." And back in Karachi, over the ruins of his earliest prison, a wind chime made of broken quills hung from a fig tree, placed there by an anonymous traveler. Each chime etched with a single word: doubt, mercy, silence, return, and on certain nights, when the wind came from the east and the stars blinked slow above the bones of the old walls, the chimes would ring, and those who slept nearby would dream of a man sitting alone, writing not for the world, but against it, not to be followed, but to be questioned. And so Idris bin Marwan, who outwitted a sultan, who saved a kingdom, who fractured an empire with nothing but memory, now stood as neither icon nor traitor, neither savior nor ghost, but as the question beneath all others: what will you do now that the truth no longer needs to be beautiful? In the end, it was not the wars nor the speeches, not the prisons nor the scrolls, not the statues torn down or the tributes raised high, but the quiet erasures, the forgotten corners, the sentences never quite finished that defined the afterlife of Idris bin Marwan. Centuries had passed, and still his name flickered through maps like a fault line buried beneath borders that never held, behind titles that shifted with dynasties, and footnotes ignored by those seeking certainty. And yet in a village with no name, where no empire flew its flag, a girl of 12 sat by a dying man whose lungs rasped like rusted hinges, and asked him what she would ask him every night: "Tell me the story again, grandfather, but this time, don't make Idris a hero." and the old man toothless, half blind, wrapped in a woolen cloak stitched from the uniforms of fallen soldiers, nodded slowly, and began again, not with Idris's birth, nor his imprisonment, nor even the revolt he never led but somehow lit, but with the first time he lied to someone he loved, and how the lie made him a better strategist but a worse man, how it spared lives but cost him every night's sleep after, and how the lesson, if it was a lesson, had no easy phrasing. In this version, Idris was always late, always tired, always doubting, and it was in that doubt, not despite it but because of it, that he built something the tyrants could not destroy, a tradition of unfinished thought, of brave hesitation, of what the later scholars would call the sacred pause, and in time, the girl would become the last living person in her lineage to speak Idris's name aloud, not because she revered him, but because she understood what he refused to be complete. Elsewhere, across lands once ground beneath the boots of empire, his name was now a whisper in grammar. Children were taught to question in the Idrisian mode, a way of asking where answers were denied, a syntax of silence and subversion. Philosophers taught the paradox of the prisoner, not as dogma, but as method, a way to test if one's belief still held when stripped of context and comfort, and in places where truth had once marched in banners, now it was written in chalk on city walls, erased each morning, rewritten at dusk, a ritual called the renewal, inspired not by any decree of Idris, but by the fact that he left so much unsaid, and in one particularly forgotten monastery high in the Nabatean cliffs, a monk named Qasim al-Tariq had made it his life's work to trace the contradictions across Idris's many letters, finding not a single unified philosophy, but a weather pattern of shifting tensions, reversals, retreats, and he concluded, in a final marginalia scrawled near death, perhaps Idris is not to be believed, but to be endured. It was in this spirit that the final archived the last still bearing the feather emblem, did something none had dared. It removed Idris's name from its seal, replacing it only with a question mark carved in obsidian, and its new mission was simple: to seek the thinkers before the myths took them, to preserve the flaw before the monument, to interrupt the birth of certainty itself. And so Idris became not a legacy but a lens, and through that lens, the world looked differently upon its heroes, its tyrants, its histories. Kings who once ruled by fear now had to account for silence. Ministers now trained in the ethics of contradiction, and school children asked not who won a battle, but who paid for the victory. For it was this question, hidden in the folds of Idris's original prison letters, that now anchored the world's collective memory. What was the cost of surviving, and who paid it? And when a coalition of rising scholars tried to canonize Idris once and for all, to publish the unified book, selecting the authentic teachings, it was an old woman, a former interruption orator, who burned the first draft on the steps of the new republic's capital, declaring, "You are trying to finish a man who never finished himself," and the crowd, instead of stopping her, simply watched the pages curl into ash, and then turned back to their debates. Somewhere, in what remained of Karasi, now a windswept plateau of ruins and wild grass, no longer marked on modern maps, a group of travelers lit a fire beneath a stone wall, said to have once enclosed the archive of smoke. They passed around dried figs, poured black tea into mismatched cups, and spoke not of Idris's triumphs, but of the silences in his letters, the things he never answered, the wounds he never closed. One of them, a linguist from a distant isle, read aloud the last known sentence Idris ever wrote, a fragment scrawled in the margin of a map, likely as he fled capture in his final days. "If they come for me again, I will not run. I will become the question they cannot answer." And in the long quiet that followed, none of them spoke, for there was nothing left to prove. Idris had outwitted the Sultan not merely with strategy, not even with legacy, but by refusing to become the kind of certainty that empires thrive upon. He had survived in the spaces between systems, had made doubt sacred, had left behind no empire. No doctrine, no grave, only a trail of unfinished thoughts and the courage to follow them. And so, as the wind rose and the fire died down, the travelers lifted their cups and drank, not in victory, not in grief, but in that strange, holy place between, where all revolutions begin and end with a whisper.